Well, hello everybody. So yeah, it'd be great if a few of you come to see you, and if you do, it'd be even better if you're interested in Native American languages. I teach a general introductory class on Native American languages. It's in the core even, so if you have to cover your distribution requirements. Larry had asked me to come down and talk to you guys about stories, in particular, but just about Arapaho culture and language, and Plains Indian language and culture more generally. So I thought I'd talk to you a little bit about the language, because as he said, I actually speak Arapaho and can kind of explain to you a little bit like some of the vocabulary and how the language works. And I'm probably the only person among the visitors that would be able to do that, so it seemed like a useful thing to do. So how many of you guys are among the kids that are thinking of going up to the reservation? Okay, so about half of you, okay. So I will let you know when you get up there that there's going to be virtually nobody your age that you're going to meet who's really going to be able to speak Arapaho very well. So Arapaho is what's called an endangered language, just like we talk about endangered species. And in fact, that's the case with virtually all Native American languages now, is that they're endangered. And of course, once you're very endangered, you can potentially go extinct, is one word that's sometimes used to describe certain Native American languages. So, what does it mean to talk about an extinct language or an endangered language? Well, extinct means that there are no native speakers. So most linguists would say that like Latin is extinct. And that doesn't mean people don't know it, and you can go, there's books and there's grammars and people study it and so forth, but there's nobody who grows up speaking Latin as their first language in the way that you guys would speak English or Spanish or whatever your first language was. So that's an extinct language. And there's a number of Native American languages that are like that already. So Powhatan was the language used by Pocahontas when she met John Smith at Jamestown. Is now extinct. Massachusetts is the language spoken at Plymouth Rock when the Pilgrims and the Indians got together for Thanksgiving. That's also now extinct. So they're recorded in places in dictionaries and so forth, but that's it. So Arapaho is endangered, and what that means is that there are no young people who are learning it as a first language. So that's the definition of endangerment. So Lakota, Sioux is also endangered, Cheyenne is endangered, Blackfoot, Shoshone, Ute, go down the list. There's a few that aren't in northern Canada and Alaska and Greenland, and also some of the Pueblo languages in New Mexico and Arizona are a little bit better off. But in general, this is the case with most Native American languages. And why is this? The answer really is that after World War II, in the 1950s and 1960s, television, radio started coming in, people started getting cars, they started moving more off the reservations, and getting much more exposure to the rest of the world. So for a long time in the 20th century, Native Americans were pretty much stuck on reservations. Sometimes weren't even allowed to leave, and didn't have electricity, so you didn't have phones, you didn't have radios or televisions, didn't have movies very often, so pretty much they would just live using Arapaho or Cheyenne as their daily language. But since these changes have occurred, and now it's increasing, right, with the internet and everybody's got access to English all over the world, then more and more of the kids say, well, great, there's 5,000 Arapaho people, but there's 500 million English speakers, and look at the movies they're producing and all the websites they have and all the music, and we don't have any of that stuff in Arapaho. And so English starts to look a lot more appealing or attractive than Arapaho or Cheyenne. And so a lot of the kids are much more interested, or even their parents were much more interested in that side of things than in continuing to use native languages. That's changed recently, however. They have suddenly realized, or not suddenly, but gradually realized that the language is really key to your identity. What is it that makes you Arapaho versus Cheyenne or versus Lakota? So they're all Indians, but to be specifically Arapaho is to have the Arapaho language, and it's their unique language. And so they've realized they don't want to just be English-only speakers. They want to maintain the Arapaho and the Cheyenne and other languages and preserve them if possible, and start to speak them again as well if possible. And so that you will certainly meet some kids your age, I hope, when you go up there, who are actually now studying Arapaho. And trying to learn it at least on a basic level, and so they can at least say hello and how are you, and they know like the national anthem in Arapaho and things like that. So that's kind of the language setting up there right now, and again, this is typical all over Western U.S. in terms of Native American tribes. So I thought, since you'll have a chance to meet some kids your age, I would maybe teach you a few words that they're likely to know and that you could use. And I think people always appreciate it when visitors come to the reservations and try to, at least say something. Just like if you go to Mexico or somewhere, if you can at least say like, adios even, or something, right? Or hola, ¿qué tal? It's always appreciated because you've made some effort to come to their terms, right? To recognize their culture and their language. You don't just expect them to come to you in everything. So you want to say hello. So what are you going to say? Well, already it's a little complicated because one thing you could say is haba. But that's only used by men. So women actually say dos. So this is already something really interesting that's completely unlike English, is that men and women have a completely different word. You're doing exactly the same thing, you're just saying hello. So dos, repetition, dos, okay. And haba. Haba, okay? And actually it's even more specific. This is male to male, this is female to female, and male to female, okay? So I'm going to say to you, haba, right? But up to you, I'm going to say dos, okay? So the girls have it easy because no matter who you're talking to, you're going to say dos, very good, okay? But you're going to have to decide whether to say right, or if you're talking to her? Dos. Okay. Okay, so, and this is hello. So, another thing that you very commonly would say to someone is just, how are things, right? How's it going? Something like that. So, the way to do that is, and it has kind of the stress. I should let you know it's kind of there. So, ka ni ni ni. Okay. Ka ni ni ni. Okay. So this apostrophe is like a break in the word. Okay. Ka ni ni ni. So one more time. Ka ni ni ni. Okay, pretty good. Okay, and that means how are things? And you'll be happy to know that the way to answer that is to simply drop that and say ni ni ni. Ni ni ni. Okay. So that means good. If you want to say they're bad, I guess you could, but let's say they're good. It's easier. Okay, so we're already ready to have an Arapaho conversation. Anybody want to volunteer? No eager volunteers here? Okay, I saw her volunteer by doing this, so okay.
With me?
Yep. Don't worry. It's a low-pressure situation. Okay, so I walk in, and I'm going to say to you, dos, and you're going to respond,
Dos.
all right. And then I'm going to say to you, ga ni ni
Me.
Very good. That's understandable. All right. So I said hello. You said hello. I said how are you? You said good. Okay. So you just had a 4-sentence Arapaho conversation, all in 5 minutes of learning. One more word that you could use, instead of just saying good, you might want to say yes, things are good. So yes is going to be again, there's two separate words. So men say ha, that means yes, no matter who they're talking to, and women say ah, and that means yes, no matter who they're talking to. So you see this really interesting fact that Arapaho language makes gender distinctions in the actual vocabulary. And there's other examples of this, and I won't give you, a bunch of examples, but just that's already really fascinating to think about the fact that women in their whole life would never say ha, unless they're like mimicking a man or something like that. They're always going to say ah, and that means yes. And men are never going to say ah, right? It's just a word they would never use. They're always going to say ha. And they both mean exactly the same thing. They both mean yes. But it's as if, well, so we're going to add a little bit to the conversation. So anybody want to volunteer to? Still no volunteers. She pointed at you. You willing to do it?
Yeah.
Okay. So let's have you start the conversation with me.
Okay. Aba.
Okay. Aba.
Kuin ini.
Ha. Nin ini. And then I would ask you, Afternoon? Like, and you? And what might you say?
Ha.
Mm-hmm.
Ni ini.
All right, there you go. You just had a 6-exchange Arapaho conversation, okay? So let's, somebody else. Actually, let's do one more brave person. I'm going to ask you guys to try it with each other in pairs real quick. Larry, you want to give it a shot?
Sure.
Pick on the teacher, okay? So I'm gonna come up and I'm gonna say haba.
Aba.
Okay. Ka ni ini.
Ni ini.
Or if you want to be more specific,
Okay.
ha.
Ha. Ni ini.
Okay? All right. And so I'll give one final phrase you can use here, which is, okay? So here's everything we need. We greet someone, haba, are those. Then we ask them, ga nini ini, are things good? And then they're going to respond, ha or ah, nini ini. And then they can say, ah nananan, and what about you? And that person can say, ha or ah, nini ini. Okay, so this is the first thing we do. Second thing we do. Third thing we do, combining that. And the fourth thing we do. Okay. Want to give it a shot? Sure. Okay. Haba.
Haba.
Ga nina ini?
Nina ini. Oh. Ha. Nina ini.
Yeah.
How do you, I don't know how to say that.
Oh. Ah.
Ah.
Nananan.
Nanan.
And I say, ha, nina ini. All right, there you go. Standard Arapaho greeting. Now, let's see, one more woman. You want to try it?
Sure.
Okay, so dos.
Dos.
Ga nina ini.
Ni ini.
Okay, and then
Nananan.
ha, nina ini. There you go. Good job. All right, so just really quickly, everybody turn to one person right next to you and just practice this once. All right. Okay, everybody got through that? So, if you guys want to practice some more, if you want to practice this some more, there's actually a website that we've done at CU on Arapaho language learning, and it has sound files, so you can go through this exact same thing, and you can hear native speakers. So if you just Google Arapaho language project, then you'll find the website. Plus, I guess I'm being filmed here, so maybe somebody could like show the film even. So there's your basic greetings that you can use. And I guess maybe the last thing you would want to be able to say is goodbye, right? Once everything's over and done with. So number 5 here is goodbye. And the word is, still writing. Okay. So this is sort of say goodbye. What it literally means is we will see you again. So ha cha na haban. Okay, yeah. Ha cha na haban. Okay. So you might be wondering, like, why is this word so long? Right? Like, and also, we will see you again. That's 5 words in English, right? How could 5 words be 1 word in Arapaho? And is that common? And how, what's going on here? So I thought I'll teach you a little bit about how the Arapaho language actually works. Okay, so this is not something that I would expect you to be able to use with the kids, or maybe some of the kids can't do this either up there. But it's just kind of interesting to see. So Native American languages are all not the same. That's the first thing I'd kind of like you to know. So sometimes people think all Indians talk alike, or there's one kind of general Indian language, and maybe there's variations from tribe to tribe. Completely untrue. So what you actually have are completely separate language families. So English, German, French, Spanish are all related to each other. They are all part of what's called the Indo-European language family. It goes back thousands of years. So if you've ever learned German, you probably know, right, that the word for hand in German is Hand, right? And the word for dog is Hund, which sounds like hound in English. So you can actually see resemblances. So that's what makes a language family. They all derive from the same source. So on the other hand, English is not related to Chinese. And the words for hand and dog in Chinese are just not going to look like anything in German or English. So the same thing with Native American languages. Arapaho and Cheyenne are related. And so the words are going to look somewhat similar, but just like you can't understand German, maybe if I say Hand, you could say, oh, hand, right? But you're not going to understand somebody just talking German fluently. Same thing with Arapaho and Cheyenne. There's words they could point to that look similar, but Arapaho people do not understand Cheyenne people when they talk. On top of which, Lakota is a completely different language family. So Lakota compared to Arapaho or Cheyenne is like English compared to Chinese. That's how different it is. So there's an incredible amount of diversity in Native American tribes and Native American languages that people really don't appreciate. So, and Ute, by the way, is the other common language from Colorado, from the western slope. Ute is actually related to Aztec, believe it or not. So if you trace it back far enough, you can actually see resemblances between the Aztec language and Shoshone and Ute. So that's one important thing to know. Second important thing to know is the structure of Native American languages is really, really different from English. And so, what do I mean by structure? Well, this is just one word, so this is a vocabulary difference. So this means you, and obviously it doesn't look anything like English, but this is structure, right? So we will see you again. So English, we have verbs, right? We have nouns, which are also subjects. And then we have like an object. People still do this in English class? Yes. Yeah, a little bit? Yeah, right? So we see you, that kind of thing. Well, what's going on with Arapaho here? I mean, where would the verb be? And is it all a verb? Or, what's going on? So what's actually going on is I'll give is, this is the part that means you. This is the part that means we. This is the part that means again. This part means will. And this is the part that means see. So future again, see, we, you. So a completely different order, right? On top of which it's all one word. So, and you might say, well, why couldn't you just write it like that space, that space, that space, right? Because they do seem to have separate little parts. But Arapaho is what's called, technical linguistic term, the one term I'm going to throw at you today. Polysynthetic. So polysynthetic means a language which combines many different concepts into a single word or a single thought. English is not polysynthetic. Every word means one thing. Arapaho is. So let me give you, well actually, let me give you a simpler example before. Is everybody's okay if I erase this? Everybody's got this stuff down? Okay. So most of you guys have taken probably like French or Spanish, or at least a lot of you. So if I want to say in Spanish, like, I'm speaking, I have to say hablo, right? If I'm talking to you and I want to say you're speaking, I'm going to say hablas, right? And then if we're talking about some other person, we'd say habla. So in Spanish, you don't even need to say like yo is I, right? And tú is you, and you don't even need to say that. All you need to say is hablo, and I understand it. So Arapaho works kind of like Spanish, as opposed to English. So if I'm just using a really simple word like, let's say walk, then if I want to say I'm walking, I put that on there. So I say tu vis na. If I want to tell you you're walking, I put that on there. So that's I, and that's you. So I say tu vis you're walking. Tu vis na. I'm walking. If I want to say he's walking, then I put a T on there, and it means he or she. Tu vis Okay? So maybe Arapaho isn't quite so weird, right? Once I make this parallel to Spanish, it kind of makes sense. So you can understand how a language would do this. So, so that's part of the way Arapaho works. It sticks things on, the base word. So what if I want to say, I was walking in the past, as opposed to I'm walking right now? How am I going to do that? Well then, I put on a prefix. So by putting that there, I've converted I am walking right now to I was walking in the past. Ni chibisano. So again, you don't necessarily need to write all this down. I mean, well, Larry can tell you to write down whatever he wants, I guess. But I'm not teaching this as an Arapaho language lesson per se. But I'm trying to show you the structure and how it works and the complexity, and to see how different cultures and different languages look at the world in very different ways and think about the world in very different ways. That's really what I'm trying to show you. So one final example. What if I want to turn this into the future? I will walk. Well, then I can put this on there instead. So, chibisana, I'm walking. Nik chibisana, I was walking. At chibisana, I will walk. You see how the system works? So, if I said Nit chibisat, past walking she was walking. Pat chibisat, she will be walking. Pat chibisan, you will walk. Nit chibisan, you walk. So, the fact that you put all these prefixes and suffixes on is why you end up with stuff like this. The words get bigger and bigger and bigger. So just to give you something extreme, as an example, So this is an actual word used in an actual Arapaho story. Okay? And in fact, another word actually used in a story, even longer. Okay? So, okay? So it's a single word. There's no part of this you can take out and use on its own. As it's all prefixes and suffixes added on to something. So what could that possibly mean, right? And how could anyone possibly understand something like this? So what it actually means, this has to do with confusion. And this has to do with the ways in which someone can be confused. And then all of this has to do with making people or things confused. So what this word actually means is, it's talking about a ceremonial item. And it says, and they're trying to say, people don't understand how the ceremonial item is used anymore, because over the years they've gotten all confused due to people not knowing the right answer and making up stuff and getting these people all confused about this ceremonial item. Okay, so that's the concept, and that concept is expressed by this one word. All the ways in which this particular ceremonial item has been confused for people by the misinformation given to them. So, if you don't believe me, look at the reading I gave you, and look at like an average sentence, and you'll notice an average sentence has one word in it, or maybe two words at the most, right? And there's these really, really long chunks with all these dashes separating them and so forth and so on. So you've got the reading already, right? You had so you saw that. I'm sure you didn't pay a lot of attention to the Arapaho, but this is polysynthetic. So to people that think that Native American languages were primitive, or that Native American people were primitive thinkers, so this is my answer to that, right? Because that's the other myth you always hear about Native American societies, like in the 19th century, is it was primitive, right? They didn't have many words, they couldn't express abstract thoughts, all they thought about was hunting and food gathering, they couldn't think abstractly or rationally. So maybe you guys don't think that. I hope you don't. Right? You've had in this school more chances to meet with Arapaho people, for example, and study the culture, so maybe you're beyond that. But it's a really widespread myth, even today, I think, in American society, that primitive people, so-called primitive people, actually exist, and that they truly are somehow emotionally or mentally primitive. But I think anybody who can use this successfully and understand it and express their thoughts in that kind of a way or this kind of a way, hard to imagine that person being any different than you or I. In fact, linguistically speaking, they even may be a lot smarter than you or I. So I think that's something to really keep in mind. Okay? So take-home lessons, basic Arapaho conversation, the fact that men and women have different words, really interesting. The fact that all Native American languages are not alike, and that they're in different families. The fact that Cheyenne and Arapaho are related, but Ute is related to Aztec. The fact that Arapaho kind of works like Spanish, sticking all these prefixes on, and then polysynthetic. Okay, so there's your first 20 minutes of Introduction to Native American Languages, CU Linguistics 3220. Okay, the quiz will be next time. So with that, why don't I stop and see if you guys have any questions, or would like to see different examples, or how much more time do we have?
We have until about 34.
Okay, and we could certainly talk about the stories. I definitely want to talk about one of those as well. But yeah.
I was just curious because in the reading too, like some of these words I saw the number 3 a lot. I was wondering if that was like a pronunciation thing or.
Yeah, actually, Yeah, it's right there.
Yeah.
So Arapaho has its own alphabet, so it has this, like that symbol, represents this kind of like stop, where you would say, cha, cha, in, na, hu. So that's a letter. And then the 3 is also an actual letter in the Arapaho alphabet. And it's just like, well, why in the heck would you do that? Well, in Arapaho, it's possible to have like a T and an H come together, and you would say, ta, ha, as 2 separate sounds. But then there's also a sound, tha, right, like in English 3. And so if you write that as TH, then no one's going to know when they're reading whether you're supposed to be saying ta, ha, or tha. And so what they decided to do was to write this like that. And they said, well, how are we going to write tha? Well, it's in 3, and that's a real common word, and there's a 3 on the keyboard, so we'll use that to say tha, and then ta-ha will be like that. So and this was invented by the Arapahos themselves in the late 1970s, early 1980s. That's when they decided to start writing their language. And they have some other sounds, like they have an X in their language, but it sounds like ha, which doesn't really exist in English. So the word for skunk is ho. So but for the most part, everything else looks recognizable. Yeah, good question. And then there's another question over there, I think, and then one here. Nope, okay.
So was the 1980s like the first time they've like written down their language actually?
There were people that recorded it earlier. So the stories you have were written down in 1900, but it was done by an outsider, as kind of like me, a linguist, anthropologist. The first time the tribe actually started writing on their own was in fact the 1980s. So really recently. And they did that partly because they recognized the language was being lost. And they decided, we've been passing things down orally all through history, just by memory. But what if the kids aren't learning? Then all these stories and all this knowledge is just going to disappear. And so that's when they started writing it. Other questions? If not, then why don't we talk a little bit about the literature and the stories. So, as I just said, Native Americans did not have written literature outside of Central America, the Aztecs and people like that. So everything they had was oral knowledge, which means it had to be told and retold over and over, and people had to listen and memorize and then retell themselves. And so the stories that I gave you were recorded in 1900, but were likely passed down over hundreds and even thousands of years. So that's what makes oral literature really interesting, is that it can be preserved for that amount of time. And the way the stories would be told was quite specific. So the Arapahos and many of the other Plains Indian tribes believed that you didn't tell stories during the summer, only during the winter. And they actually had a belief that if you told stories during the summer, that like a snake would come and attack you or bite you in your teepee or something like that. Of course, this actually makes sense, though, right? When would you want to do your hunting? When would you want to do gathering of wild plants? When the weather's good, right? And when there's lots of daylight. The wintertime, you have no electricity, there's a lot of snow, you can't travel, you're sitting around in a teepee, well, tell some stories. But nevertheless, they actually made an official rule that you only do this. And winter is the first snowfall, and then summer is the first thunderstorm. So you can only tell the story between the first snowfall and the first thunderstorm. So there's lots of different kinds of these stories as well. So just like we have, you go to the movies, right? There's chick flicks, and there's sci-fi, and there's, action movies, and so forth. Same thing with Native American narratives. So you could have like a creation myth, which would be the origin of the world. There are legends about, kind of like we have Superman and Batman. Native Americans had similar kind of legendary characters that they would tell stories about. Superheroes, if you want to think of it that way. They would have history as well. So the battle that we fought in 20 years ago that everyone needs to remember and celebrate. And then you would have songs, prayers, and then they would have funny stories as well, obviously. And one of the kind of funny stories they loved to tell was trickster narratives. So the story that you read, or that I gave to Larry for you guys to read on the dancing ducks, is a trickster narrative. And the name for the trickster, I'll write it up here, is... Okay, so that's the Arapaho trickster. So it's pronounced ni, stop, tha, niha-tha. So interestingly enough, the word for white person is also niha-tha. So I think that's one of the most interesting things to know about Arapaho culture. When you go and visit, the people who speak the language, to the extent they talk about you, will be talking about hina niha-fa'u, those tricksters. So what is a trickster? A trickster is somebody who not just does the wrong thing, but does the wrong thing all the time, often on purpose. As the name suggests, always trying to trick people. So niha-tha in Arapaho is always looking for ways to get something for nothing, always butting in where he shouldn't, always doing things too many times or too often, always saying the wrong thing, sleeping with the wrong people, all these kind of things, theft and so forth and so on. And so every single story about niha-tha is some wild, crazy adventure where niha-tha does something stupid. A number of them are quite obscene as well, so maybe we won't go into those here, but they're in the book. And the trickster character is a character which is very, very widespread in Native American culture. So the Sioux have one called Iktomi, the Cheyenne have another one. In some cases, the coyote represents the trickster. So if you're in Navajo or Hopi country, then when they talk about the trickster, they're talking about the coyote. However, in the Pacific Northwest, it's the raven, which is understood as the trickster. If you go to the southeast, like Choctaw, Chickasaw, Cherokee, it's the rabbit, which is the trickster figure. So it varies from place to place. In Arapaho, it's actually not an animal at all. It's kind of like a weird superhero figure. So just to see if you're understanding what I'm saying, or maybe you can help me, can you guys think of like television or movie characters who, from what I've said, would be possibly like a trickster character? Or any kind of pop culture figure? Someone who just like loves to bug adults for the sake of bugging them, always says something out of place and obscene and what?
Is Dennis the Menace kind of one? Except he doesn't do it on purpose, really.
Yeah. South Park, maybe, or
Yeah, there you go. Or Mad Magazine.
SpongeBob.
Okay, Mad Magazine,
SpongeBob.
SpongeBob. Okay, so and none of those are exactly equivalent, but that maybe gives you a sense. Or Bart Simpson is on The Simpsons would be kind of somewhat of a trickster figure as well. So. So it's easy to understand why these people would be funny, right? So I'll tell you a couple of other trickster figures, trickster stories. Okay, so here's an actual Arapaho story. So niha-tha is walking down the river one day, and as he's walking along, he looks down in the water and he sees a whole bunch of plums in the water, like really ripe plums that look so good. And so he says, "I'm going to dive into the water and I'm going to get those plums." So he dives in, dives down. He can't get to the bottom of the stream to get the plums, so he floats back up. He says, so it's like, okay, I'm gonna run back and I'm gonna really jump hard and really dive deep in the stream and get those plums. And of course, the real story, there's all kinds of details. He goes back, he thinks real hard. He starts going, boy, he's running as fast as he can. He dives into the water, that kind of stuff. So he dives into the water, going down furiously trying to get down to where those plums are, and he can't get those darn plums. So he pops back up to the surface. So now he's really getting angry and frustrated. He does this like 3 or 4 times. So then he says, okay, I'm going to be clever now. I'm going to get those plums. So then he goes and he finds 2 big rocks. He ties one rock to one foot, one rock to the other foot. He gets on a branch, jumps down into the river, floats all the way to, well, not floats, sinks like a rock all the way to the bottom, gets there, looks around at his feet, looks up in the air, and sees the plums hanging above the river off of a bush. Okay. So you get it? Right, he saw the reflection in the water. So then he sits there and he says, well, something roughly like, oh crap, what an idiot I am. And that's where the story ends, with him like stuck on the bottom of the water with the plums, with the rocks, and it's like, well, now you've got trouble, you know. So Wile E. Coyote would be another example, maybe, of the trickster figure. So the trickster figure is someone who thinks he's really smart. He thinks he's brilliant, right? And he's always saying how clever he is and how but in reality, he's stupid. And he's stupid in a very specific way. He doesn't think about consequences. He doesn't think about context. He tends to trust his eyes, like, too literally. He doesn't think about, well, is there something more to this situation than what I see here? Or is there something more to what someone's telling me than it seems? And he just doesn't do that. He's very literal-minded. And so he constantly, by overestimating his own intelligence, gets himself into these ridiculous situations. But the trickster's immortal, so like Wile E. Coyote, right, he's always back to chase the Roadrunner one more time. So another trickster story. So the trickster, Nihatha, is walking down the stream. Again, he always is wandering around aimlessly. That's what tricksters do. They do things for no purpose, no reason. Kind of like wandering the halls, right, just for the heck of it. And he sees a little bird, and the little bird takes his eyes out of his head and throws the eyes up into the air. And so the eyes are like way, way up, like on top of a tree. And so the little bird is sitting on the ground, and he says, wow, I see buffalo miles and miles away. And so Nihatha sees this and says, whoa, that's a really good trick. I want to learn that trick. So he goes to the little bird, he says, show me how to throw my eyes. You know, show me, show me, show me. And the little bird says, no, Nihatha, I know you. You'll screw this up. You don't want to do this. Just leave it alone. But of course, Nihatha always insists, like, no, you know, you've got to show me how to throw my eyes. And so finally the little bird says, you know, you can imagine the little bird rolling his eyes and saying, okay, but I'm warning you. So he shows Nihatha the trick. He says, what you do is you take your eyes, you pop them out, you toss them up at the top of the tree, and then when you want them to come back to your into your eye sockets, you have to say this special word, ni'ache, which is just a meaningless word. So Nihatha says, okay, I've got it. And the little bird says, now I'm warning you, however, you can use this 4 times, and only 4 times. And if you do it more, then you're going to screw everything up. So Nihatha immediately sets off down the river, tosses his eyes, they sit up in the top of the tree, you know, he's standing on the ground, seeing everything for miles around. It's so great, it's so wonderful. He does, you know, ni'ache, and the eyes pop back in. He says, oh, this is fun. So then he walks down the river, can't resist, does it again. You can imagine what's happening here, right? So he does it 4 times, the eyes have come back, it's so great. And then he runs into one of his friends, and his friend says, what's up, Nihatha? And Nihatha says, I can throw my eyes up in the air. So of course Nihatha has to be the best, right? And has to brag and show off. So the friend says, no way, dude, right? I mean, something like that. So Nihatha takes his eyes out, throws them up, right? The friend says, wow, that's amazing. And then Nihatha says, yeah. And then he says, ni'ache. And nothing happens. And so the eyes are stuck at the top of a giant cottonwood tree out in the plains. So he's yelling, ni'ache, ni'ache, ni'ache. And nothing happens. So finally, the little chickadee flies along several days later and says, Nihatha, why are you sitting here? And he says, well, I can't go anywhere. My eyes are up in the top of the tree. And so the chickadee says, I told you, didn't I? And so the little chickadee agrees to give him some eyes. But what the chickadee does, that's the little bird. He takes his eyes out and puts them in Nihatha's eye sockets. And so the Arapahos say, that's why the trickster has little beady eyes, because this bird that had to bail him out of the situation. So again, you see kind of the common themes here, right? Overestimating his own intelligence, too concerned with other people's opinion, not thinking through situations carefully, not listening, showing lack of constraint, showing off, all these kind of things. So that's the trickster. So these are really funny stories. They're all over Native America. And just as a side detail, one of the Arapaho people told me one time, you know what? Actually, that story's about something else. And I said, what? You know, it's like, it seems like a nice moral, it seems funny, but what else is it about? He said, it's about Sputnik. So this is 1957. People know this history at all, right? The Russians, the Americans, the space race starts. Sputnik is the first satellite. So what's a satellite? It's something which you shoot up into the air and which flies around and lets you see everything for miles around. And so this Arapaho guy said, you know, actually, our ancestors knew that this was going to happen, and they predicted it. And that story about the Trickster is really about white people and all of their space satellites that they're shooting up in the air. So completely as a side issue, I just thought it's really interesting that they're reinterpreting the story for modern times. You know, you first think of it as, oh, it's a cute Native American story from, you know, long ago, and then you realize, no, they can, just as we reinterpret stories and reimagine the meaning of things, they can too. So it was just an interesting moment for me when I realized, again, don't think Native American people just live in the past, or don't think all of their stories and their language is just about the past. They're very actively thinking about the present and using their literature and their stories in that kind of a way. So that's maybe another lesson to think about. Let's see. Yeah.
So is the trickster a person?
It's never really defined. It's not. He's not really human, or even it's not clear if it's a he or a she, because they never describe the trickster. They just say the trickster. But it seems human-like, but clearly not human. So why would they call white people? Why would they take, you know, that name and apply it to you guys? What does that say about how Arapaho people see kind of, you know, middle class, Front Range Colorado, well, not just that, but every American? Yeah?
Well, it's like all throughout history, since white people came here, they've kind of been forcing, like making treaties and then breaking them and forcing the Americans out of their homes. So it's probably not a very good view looked on us from the Americans.
Yeah, it's definitely not. Yeah, so we trick Native Americans out of their land, their and other things as well, their money. Beyond that, they think that whites are, in a certain sense, too greedy, always looking for more, not satisfied with what they have, which is a lot of what the Trickster is about. Some of them will tell you white people are oversexed or oversexualized or something like that. And they'll say things like, you know, white people are always doing things for no reason. They're not cautious, they're not calm. They tend to just go out and do crazy stuff all the time and get themselves into trouble. So, you know, that, hate to tell you that, but that, I mean, that is the Native American view in many cases of white society. And it's still the view today. You know, to be honest, people will come down here to Colorado, like some of the people who visited this school, and they'll say, wow, people drive crazy in Denver. You know, it's like, why are they in such a hurry to get somewhere? Where are they going, you know? Or why do they need to have such a big house? Or, you know, why do they need to have such an expensive car? Why are they working so hard that they never have time to relax so they can get that expensive car, that expensive house? So they have a fairly critical view of our society. You know, that we're too acquisitive, too busy, don't take time to think, don't take time to relax, to appreciate nature, or to appreciate sacredness, and, you know, all those kind of things. So that's all kind of wrapped up in the Trickster stories. And some of these Trickster stories now, they'll actually conclude them by saying, and that's how white people are. So they've reinterpreted the stories as being actually about white people who are also Nihatha rather than the Trickster figure. So having said that, I don't want to leave you with the impression that Arapaho people are like just critical of everything in Colorado or of all of us as non-Indians. That's certainly not true, and I've actually been amazed how hospitable they are and how open they are to talking with me and hosting me, you know, come over and eat, come stay in our house, what can we do for you, how can we help you, can we tell you some stories, you know, can you help with the language, and all these kind of things. So I've had a really, really great experience. with them, and they really appreciated the things that I've done. So as Larry said, I'm working on a dictionary. They're concerned about their language being lost, so they think it's great to have somebody work on a dictionary. You know, they realize some of these stories aren't being told anymore because the people are forgetting them or the oral traditions are dying. So they're extremely happy with this book, which, by the way, is the three names on the cover, me and the other two people are Arapaho people that I worked with. So it's a joint project. So I would imagine any of you that go up there are going to receive a really nice greeting, especially because this school has a relationship with the tribe. So you're not just like, who are these people and what are they here for, right? It's like, oh yeah, we understand this. We know the school. We know why they're here. And we're going to have an equal relationship. We'll go visit them. They'll come visit us. So I think that's really valuable. But at the same time, I think it's always good, myself, when you encounter another culture, what can you learn from that culture? And including what criticisms do they have of your culture, and might some of those criticisms be useful or valid to think about as ways to improve? Certainly, we seem to have lots of criticisms of Native Americans in this country, right? We're in terms of our stereotypes of them and what they should or should not be doing, and that kind of thing. And we're much less willing to listen to their thoughts about us. So I don't know if in 2 days of a visit up there, you may not have a chance to have really deep discussions or anything, and they're probably not going to want to give you critical viewpoints. They want to welcome you and make you feel good. But nevertheless, as you read some of these stories, you might think about the two sides of the two cultures and what we could learn from each other.
I was just kind of interested through reading these stories, how like the casual listener to the stories, were they really listening for meaning and morals, or was it just something that, would they ever explain these stories like you were just explaining them to us, or do you think they were just more just told and just kept that way?
I think they did explain them, and in fact, when I record some of these stories, they'll explain them afterwards to you. So the equivalent is like if you guys go to CU or any other college you go to, and you take an English class or like a Spanish or French literature class, you're going to spend a whole bunch of time not just reading like a story or a novel, but you're going to have a teacher explaining you all the meanings. And that's, in fact, that's what college is about. If you just want to read a French novel, fine. But if you want to read a French novel and really understand what it meant at the time and the deeper meanings today, you really need somebody to help you. And that's why you study literature in college. So the Native Americans did the same thing. They would explain to the kids what these stories mean. They would talk about them afterwards. And so it wasn't just listening kind of like aimlessly. They had their own equivalent of literature class in college, although it obviously wasn't a formal setting like that. And so what you find is the younger people, for example, won't necessarily understand these stories themselves when they hear them, or they'll see the funny part. But then if you talk to the teller or some older person afterwards, they'll say, "Yeah, those kids were laughing, but I don't think they got this other part of the story. There's a deeper level or another meaning that's involved, and so forth." So they would learn over their life and get better at understanding the stories, and eventually they're kind of these guys I worked with were professors of Arapaho literature. And they just knew so many interpretations and so many different ways of looking at things.
Just real quickly, how are you finding the more contemporary stories that you're working on now with that newest book? Is there surprising stuff with it? I'm sure.
So a lot of them are about like whites and Arapahos and encounter, and how to deal with that. And they're so funny. A lot of them are just really humorous kind of things. They're jokes, basically. And what's interesting is they joke about Arapaho's own ignorance of like white European American culture, but at the same time making fun of the white people. What would be one example of this that I could tell in? Okay, 1 minute joke I'll leave you with. So this contemporary story. So it's called a Believe It or Not story. So an Arapaho guy is on an airplane. And the airplane is flying through the sky to Casper, somewhere in Wyoming, doesn't matter. And then the pilot comes on and says, "Well, there's going to be a delay because we're running short on fuel." So they say, "Well, what are we going to do?" And this Arapaho guy goes up to the pilot and says, I can take care of it for you. Don't worry about it. But you're going to need to stop the plane." So they stop the plane, and they open the door. The Arapaho guy lets the ladder down, climbs down, runs over to the filling station, gets some gas, climbs back up the ladder, put it in the wing, and the plane flies on to its destination. Believe it or don't believe it, it's up to you. So what's going on there? Who's being made fun of? Is it the Arapaho people who would believe that a plane could stop in midair, wait for it to be refilled, and then fly on? Or is it the white people who couldn't think of the idea of going to a gas station to get some gas? After all, you know, it works for cars. Why wouldn't it work for planes? Is it just a goofy story? I don't know. But anyway, Native Americans have a great sense of humor. Maybe that's my departing lesson for you. They're not stoic. They have a great sense of humor. All right.